Alright, welcome back to my channel, everyone. For those of you who are returning, if you are new and you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe and notification bell, hit the like button, and that really helps out the channel. Today I thought I would go over how I got into the franchise known as Gundam. However, I need to go ahead and say that back in the day, I wasn't a huge mech fan. I'm doing this so that people who are not fans of mech anime can at least understand that not all mech fans started off that way. The only time I really cared about mechs or any kind of robotic thing was if it was a droid in Star Wars, or say something like the Cyclops from Halo Wars, and maybe even the Avatar, Redeemer, Wolverine, or the Titan from Command and Conquer. Now, most people, of course, would ask about probably the most popular mech franchise of all time, which would be Transformers. Now, as a kid, I did see the show at the time, the newest show at the time, which was uh, Armada, and I had a few toys from that series. However, after my dad watched a few episodes of it with me, he kept saying that's not them, that's not them. I'm like, what do you mean? And he's like, he told me and showed me the original show, and then I was really kind of upset because I enjoyed the characters and the story a lot more in the original, and I even enjoyed the toys more because they were easier to transform compared to the newer ones that I had, which were far more complex and were just way too hard for a kid to transform, in my opinion, on a regular basis. So the toys I had just kind of sat there. I never really did anything with them. They just kind of rotted away, I guess you could say. I never really touched them. I never transformed them. I never really tried because I didn't care. I was just like, I'm not going to try because I know these things are expensive and they are just too complicated for like my 7-year old head to actually do. I mean, my only time I ever transformed was when my dad did it, and it took him like 2 hours with a manual. So, yeah, it was difficult. The only other one I had to say that I had interest in was Zoids. Now, Zoids is a really interesting thing because it was actually a mech show. It was an anime. Now, at the time, I didn't know what anime was. I thought that there were certain shows that looked a certain way that were just different types of cartoons, but I didn't realize that they all shared a genre together, or a medium together, I should say. It was interesting and I really liked the show, but as a kid, I could never find when it was supposed to come on. I always remembered it saying that at 3:30 it was supposed to come on. Now, it probably was because it was a different time zone, and maybe for me it didn't come on until 4:30. I don't know. But where I lived was down in the really far southern area of Mississippi, basically right on the beach, where Biloxi is. And I tried to watch it when I was a kid, whenever we had cable, and I could never find it. And every time I did, it was on the weekend, and it was always a rerun of an episode that I had already seen. It's like I could only catch the same 6 episodes. I could never see something new. And then eventually, of course, we ended up losing cable. But in that time, I started to grow a hatred for a certain particular insanely popular series that everyone and their mother knows, which of course would be Dragon Ball Z. Now, I know it's not the show's fault. It could have been mine, or it could have been the broadcasters or the networks or whoever. But every time I tried to watch the Zoids, it would always be Dragon Ball on in its place. Now, I remembered it was supposed to come on at like 2:30, show a the new episode, and then probably show a rerun, and then it was supposed to be the Zoids new episode. But it never happened. Every time Zoids was supposed to come on, it was always another episode of DBZ. And I'm like, why is this show playing? Why is it plain? It's supposed to be Zoids. So clearly, it grew I grew resentment for that show because it would always be plain when I thought my show was supposed to be plain. Now it could my show could have Zoids could have uh, aired earlier or it could have aired later. I don't really know, but it did definitely made me have a hatred for Dragon Ball Z. The funny thing is that even though I hate DBZ, I've never gone back and tried to watch Zoids. I really should do that. Um, I've always had an interest in it, and I really do feel like I should check it out now, considering how much more I like in the mecha genre. And that was basically my experience before I got into Gundam as a whole. So that was basically like my pre-hardcore anime days and etc. So now we're going to get into the actual progression of how I got into it. So basically, the beginning of my journey would actually probably start back in 2012. Like I said, I didn't always have cable. I always had different times where I would have cable, I wouldn't, and stuff like that. So I didn't really grow up with Toonami the same way a lot of other people did. The only other thing is, though, is that it took me a while to actually jump into it. In 2012, I got into it, which was my senior year of high school. And I got heavily into it the summer before I went to my senior year. And I got really into it throughout those first few years. And I've been basically a huge weeb ever since. And eventually, of course, that meant that I had to, I eventually got into mech as well. And eventually, I, I watched a show called Knights of Sidonia. And this was right around the same time I started dating my current fiance. And, I watched it on her, I watched it on Netflix, and I really liked it. I thought it was a great show, but it didn't make me into a huge mecha fan yet. And this is actually right before I started to get into Gundam heavily. Um, but the reason why is because also that same year, I started my first job, which was working at a grocery store that um, was a pretty big grocery store name. I don't really want to say their name because companies nowadays are so happy just because you said their name. It's like, why? But anyways, the big chain grocery store, and my supervisor was a really cool dude, but he was a pretty big anime fan himself. And the thing is that the coworkers were basically, there's two different groups. You had the young people, and then you had the ancient people. And I love the old timers. They were great. They did a good job. They taught me a lot, and they were good people. I'm not saying anything bad about them. I'm just saying that they've been there since like the 70s or the 80s or the 90s. They've been there a while, but they're still good people. I don't have any ill will towards them or anything. It's just most of them are older, so they didn't have any similar interests as someone like myself would have. So the younger group were the ones that typically had people who liked anime. And even within that, you had, another slight division where you had people who liked it and people who didn't really know anything about it, and people who didn't like it at all. But the majority of the people who did like it were around my age. And there was really only one that really liked it almost as much as I did, which was my supervisor. And he was awesome. But his favorite show was Gundam. And he would always talk about it, talk about the franchise to the point of, at first it was just kind of like, yeah, okay, whatever. I can kind of, ignore it, look past it because I didn't really care. It was a mech show. Then it was a point of kind of a little bit of frustration, and then it became like kind of annoying and irritating. And after I basically went through the motions, I went through the motions of basically being an anime fan who's getting into mech for the first time. I started to actually show interest in it. I started to be interested in what he was talking about because some of it did sound kind of cool. Eventually, I ended up at a friend's house of mine who is no longer a friend of mine now, but they were a pretty big friend back in the day. And we were talking about it, and I told him about my supervisor, and he goes, that's interesting. I actually kind of want to play. I want to play a Gundam game. So he ended up going through the Xbox Live thing and found a Dynasty Warriors game, which was the first one. And he downloaded the demo and he played it, and I actually got hooked into it. And I wasn't even playing; like I was just watching them. I think, man, this is really cool, and I was kind of interested. So after I left, a few days later, I went to a GameStop and I bought Dynasty Warriors Gundam 1 and Gundam 3. Gundam 2, apparently, for some reason on the 360 is like kind of rare. I don't really understand why, but it kind of is. But I do have that version now. It's just that it took a while to get. But anyways, after playing those games, the first two, or the first one and the third one, I should say, as you play, I kept getting introduced to new characters, and they kept popping up, and then I kept I kept being introduced to new suits that would constantly pop up, and then I get, once you like kind of beat a certain character or a section of the story mode or whatever, you'd get these like encyclopedia entries where you could go in there and actually read up on the characters and sometimes the suits, but that was really only in the third game. The first game, it was just the characters. But basically, it'd give you a rundown of certain events in the story that they played a role in, what their names are, and basically gives you kind of a brief synopsis of what's going on in the story. But it always sounded kind of intriguing. And after a while of unlocking all these characters and reading on these bios, I was really interested in watching the franchise. But as I played the games, I realized how drastically different the characters looked, and then I started to realize that there are so many different Gundam titles that this is going to be a big chore. I did end up going back to my friend, my supervisor, and asked him how I should do it. He gave me a few different options, but I went with the one that he said is probably going to be the best experience, but the most difficult for someone who's not used to old anime. But starting with the original. And I said, well, that makes sense. If you're going to start anywhere, you should start with the beginning of the story. So that's what I did. And now we're going to get into my experience with the shows when I first started watching them. So here it comes. The first day I decided to actually sit down and watch the show. And I knew it wouldn't have the best animation. He warned me about all that and stuff like that. So I wasn't too worried. I knew what I was getting myself into. But I didn't realize that the way old animation was done for anime back in like the old days was slightly different. And sometimes frame rate was actually so slow. And being so used to faster, everything being so fast, having tons of frames, really threw me for a loop. But the thing is that new anime is very slow too when it comes to frame rate, unless it's an action show. But typically, frame rate in anime is a lot slower than frame rate in a American cartoon. And still being relatively new to anime at the time was something that I hadn't fully grasped the concept of, and my head itself hadn't fully adapted to yet. And then I tried to force it into adapting into the same slower paced frame rate, but incorporating old animation. That makes it even worse. So eventually, after watching a couple episodes of the show, I ended up getting very nauseous, and I ended up going to the bathroom and losing my lunch. Yeah, I couldn't hold anything down. It literally made me sick. And I took a break from it after a while, and once I got back into it, I was pretty fine. I didn't have any problems afterwards. I was able to finish the show, and I had a good time. But then when I moved on to its sequel, which is Zeta Gundam, in my opinion, the best Gundam show ever made, it had a problem of doing the same thing and ended up making me nauseous, and I got sick. But I realized this time around it wasn't the show's fault, it was actually my own because I ended up having a kidney stone. Not a fun time, believe me, it hurts. You don't want it. You don't want a kidney stone. But it really hurt. And I was having but after a while, of course, I felt better and I passed the stone and everything. And I got back into the show and I loved it. It was great. I enjoyed it. I thought it was one of the best things I've ever seen in my life. And this show, the first one was really good, but it didn't turn me into a mega fan. Zeta Gundam, on the other hand, was the opposite of that, where it was such a good show that it basically elevated itself above just being a mech show. For me, it turned me into a mecha fan. This was the show that kind of made me go, maybe I should check out other mech shows and not just Gundam, because clearly there's a bunch of other mech shows out there, and I feel like I should try them out. And obviously, since then I have, and some are better than others, of course, but I did realize that completely ignoring a genre simply because of poor experiences from before, and of course just being jaded Americans, I guess, isn't a good thing to do. Now I will say that I kind of do the same thing with sports anime, but that's a little bit more understandable because at the end of the day I don't really like sports. But I guess you could say that since I can watch a show about car racing is technically a sports anime, so that's kind of different, I guess. I should probably check out some sports shows, but I just don't really have much of an interest in them. But I know I should definitely check them out. And if I feel like I should check out, you know, sports anime, if you're watching this, you should at least attempt to try out a certain, mech show. It doesn't have to be Gundam, it can be anything. But, check out some other mech shows. And I guess technically my story is over at this point, but I should just go ahead and run through the last show, the last TV series when it comes to the experience for the classic anime, which of course would be Gundam Double Zeta. I know a lot of people don't like this show because it's so all the comedy is front loaded, which means that all of one thing is all in the front of the story. So all of the comedy and almost goofy slapstick Looney Tunes type humor that made people hate Double Zeta is in the front of the show, but about halfway through the show has a huge tonal shift where it becomes a lot darker and is more like Zeta Gundam. I personally don't mind the goofy looniness because I enjoy that. And I also took a long break between Zeta and Double Zeta, about 4 months or so. So I feel like having so much time between shows made me not quite remember exactly how the tone was for Zeta. So watching Double Zeta and having all this comedy in the front was pretty funny to me. I actually enjoyed it. Now, if you're someone who's going to start off with, you know, going into Double Zeta immediately after watching Zeta, you're probably gonna have a different experience. You're probably not gonna like it as much because you're expecting what you got in Zeta for the sequel. You're not gonna get that until about halfway through. So it's a good show, but it takes a while to get going. And of course, it also only has subtitles because for some reason the first two original shows didn't do well over here in the early 2000s, so they didn't bother bringing over Double Zeta. And that kind of sucks, but hey, it's expected. The only other thing I have to add here is that even with this show, I also got sick. But this time around, I can't remember if it was a kidney stone or if the show itself made me sick. Um, but either way, it doesn't matter because the ironic thing is that on like a top 10 list of my favorite shows, these three would more than likely be on there. somewhere in the top 10 because I love these particular ones so much. Now, I know that a lot of people, of course, have different feelings about certain shows, especially the older ones. But that was my experience with the anime at the beginning, and that's pretty much my story. I could go over every single OVA movie and show that I watched that what effect it had on me, but that would just take way too long, and I can do that some other time in other videos. I could do separate reviews for each show if you guys would prefer that. Uh, Mention it in the comments below if you want. But go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, share the video. And hey, if you don't want to comment about, if I should do reviews of each show, but your own personal experience with how you got into Gundam, if you have, go ahead and drop it down below. I'll probably make a separate video on how I got into the Gundam models because it's a little different. It's similar, but it's a little different. And you might appreciate that on its own, aside from the main story of how I got into this series when it comes to the show. So appreciate you guys hanging out, and Yokai is out, y'all.